As promised, in this video I'm going to tell you about the system that we'll be using, and then we'll go on to meet the player characters. The system that we're going to use is Labyrinth Lord. Labyrinth Lord is a retro clone. That means that it's a copy of an old system that isn't actively supported anymore. In this case, it's a copy of basic Dungeons and Dragons, a version of Dungeons and Dragons that was very popular in the 1980s. So let's go on to meet our characters. First up we have Buttons the Frog's character, Bjorn Baldursson, who is a bard. Now in Labyrinth Lord, or basic D&D, there is no bard class, but there is an unofficial expansion which gives a bard class as well as a ranger class, which one of the other players is using, and I've gone with that. Looking at the attributes, if you're used to more recent versions of Dungeons & Dragons, you might think that these attributes are really low. We have a 5 for intelligence, and an 8 for strength, and a 7 for wisdom, etc. You're right, they are lower. What I've done is what the rules as written say, which is that you roll 3 6-sided dice in order. You don't get to assign the numbers. You don't get to re-roll. You don't get to roll 4 dice and take the 3 highest. You don't get to use any sort of point-buy system. In practice, a lot of people did use one system or another to make the attributes higher, but I've used the rules as written because I think that randomness can create some interesting results. Having said that, I do have a couple of sort of fudges. One, if you don't get at least 13 and at least one attribute, you get to raise the highest attribute to 13, and if you don't get 7 or lower for something, you have to lower your lowest attribute to 7. So in other words, you always have at least one high attribute and at least one low attribute. This mostly isn't necessary. If you roll randomly, you generally will get at least one high and at least one low attribute. In fact, I only had to do it in one case, which was the ranger character, which we'll be looking at later. But yes, the attributes are lower than they are in other versions or later versions of Dungeons & Dragons. The only other thing I've done is, because the players wanted specific classes, I allowed them to swap one pair of attributes. In this case, Buttons originally got a 15 intelligence and a 5 charisma, which would have made him a very good magic user, which is what the wizards, sorcerers are called in this version of the game. But because he really wanted to be a bard, we swapped intelligence and charisma. That was actually the only case of a person swapping. I should say, with intelligence, I treat intelligence as only being education, sort of book learning, because in my experience, people who are playing characters with high intelligence don't always act intelligently, and people who are playing characters with low intelligence don't always act stupidly. So it's pointless to pretend that that's a measure of the intelligence of the character. And the same is true of wisdom. I count wisdom as only being willpower. It isn't actually how wise or unwise or how intelligent or unintelligent you are. That's really up to the player. For those who are more used to later D&D, I don't count wisdom as having anything to do with perception. It's only willpower, whereas in later editions of Dungeons & Dragons, it's willpower and perception. The rules didn't say anything about bards needing to have a musical instrument. I thought thematically it made more sense that a bard should have to have a musical instrument, and there wasn't any price for musical instruments in the book, so I looked in the D20 system reference document, which is a later edition of Dungeons & Dragons, and that had 5 gold pieces, so I decided 5 gold pieces was the price. The reason that he has a sort of Norse name is just because, bearing in mind that intelligence in my game isn't really intelligence, it's formal education or book learning. Because his intelligence is so low, that suggested that he was some sort of outsider, that he was, from a different culture or was an outcast or something in some way. And going with the idea that the main society is some sort of cod medieval England, roughly, decided to make him pseudo-Norse. And that's an example, I guess, of randomness creating interesting results. If you look at the title screen, which I made before we rolled up the characters, he's thinking about being a splendid medieval troubadour, and he turns out to be a Norse sort of skald, basically just because of how the dice turned out. Anyway, moving along to Brother Matthias. Cornelius is playing Brother Matthias. Brother Matthias is a cleric. Again, those of you who are familiar with other editions of D&D might be going, well, where's the race? You've got the class, but you haven't got any race, which is the word that we usually use for species in fantasy gaming for some reason. Labyrinth Lord and basic D&D before it treat race as class if you're not human. In other words, if your character is a dwarf, their class is dwarf. If the character is a halfling, their class is halfling, rather than being a dwarf fighter or a halfling thief, for example. Most people don't like this. I personally do, because I think it is closer to how most fantasy works. If you have, in my experience anyway, if you have humans as the main group in the setting, usually humans will be diverse and there'll be lots of different types of humans. But then if there's a non-human species, they'll all be pretty much one thing. So, for example, in his Dark Materials trilogy, the talking bears, whose name like something Bjorn, I don't remember what they're called, but there's a race of talking bears, and they're all sort of warriors, really. And so, if you were putting that into fantasy gaming, you'd probably have a talking bear class, and they would have sort of warrior type skills, perhaps. But anyway, it's a personal thing. I just happen to like race as class. I know I'm one of the minority. But anyway, Brother Matthias is a cleric. He has a holy symbol. One of the odd things about Labyrinth Lord is that there are wooden holy symbols and metal holy symbols. Metal holy symbols cost quite a lot more, but don't do anything different. It's that odd mixture of specificity and vagueness, which you often find in older versions of Dungeons and Dragons. They'll be quite specific about, well, a torch costs this, or to hire a carpenter, well, you should pay them such and such a day. But what's the difference between a wooden holy symbol and a metal holy symbol? Oh, well, the referee can make one up if they want one. So I bought a wooden holy symbol because it's the cheaper one, and the theme of this is that the two clerics are facing money problems with their temple, and that's why they need to go into a dungeon. Why would priests go into a dungeon unless they had some sort of desperate reason to do so? And I decided that money was that reason. They also have the traditional mace, because based on a Victorian invention about priests in the Middle Ages, which claimed that a particular priest who was also a knight and a warrior claimed that he used a mace because his religion forbade him to draw blood, and so therefore he wouldn't use any pointy weapons. He just used a mace because all that did was bludgeon people without drawing blood. That seems to be entirely made up, but Dungeons and Dragons took up that picturesque idea and decided that clerics, at least initially, I don't know how it is in recent editions, I must admit, that clerics can't use pointy weapons, basically. Another thing about the older editions is that clerics are really very specifically pseudo-Christian priests. Actually, in the original printing of Dungeons and Dragons, it wasn't a holy symbol, it was a cross, specifically. And then as time has gone on, they've made it vague, or made it that you can be the priest of all different religions, but at the same time, the way that they operate is based on a romantic version of medieval priests. So, there it is. Sister Agnes is played by Artemisia. Sister Agnes is very similar to Brother Matthias. She is also a cleric. She has virtually the same equipment, the only difference being that she has one gold piece, just because of having to buy torches. It happened that someone had to contribute unevenly. That often happens in older editions. I think perhaps to a lesser extent in new editions as well. There's often a best choice. Clerics can use any armour, and chainmail is not the best armour. Bards can use up to chainmail, but clerics can use any armour. One thing I quite like about Labyrinth Lord is that the more expensive armours are out of the reach of new characters. You're not going to be able to afford to buy plate mail. Sorry, I should say the way that you determine your money is you roll 3 6-sided dice and multiply the total by 10, which gives you an average of 105 gold pieces, and plate armor costs several hundred. So there's mathematically no way that you can afford that, and you're probably not going to be able to afford the ones sort of just under that either. So you're starting out a bit sort of desperate and a bit sort of hoping that you'll survive so that you can get better gear. And I quite like that, and I wish there was more of that, actually. Some people might not like it, but I prefer it. Actually, Labyrinth Lord seems to be aimed at people who don't like it, because Labyrinth Lord says roll 3d8 instead of 3d6 to give people a little bit more money on average. But I decided to go with the 80s version. In this version, clerics don't have spells at first level. They start getting them at second level. They get one spell a day at second level, and of course it's usually Cure Light Wounds, because that's far and away the most useful first level cleric spell. I was thinking about special systems for casting spells. There are lots of systems for spells going wrong or having extra spells, or sacrificing hit points or something to have extra spells, but it turned out that nobody had any spells, and so I don't have to sort of worry about that until later. We have Ulfric the Blue, the Ranger. Again, there are no Rangers in Labyrinth Lord or basic D&D. The Halfling class is sort of like a Ranger, or at least it's the one that is closest, but Arthur, who is the player, very much wanted to play a Ranger, so that's what we did. We got the third-party supplement, which has a Ranger class in it. Why does Ulfric have a helmet? Isn't that just part of scale mail, or doesn't leather armor or chainmail or whatever come with a helmet? Well, yes, it does, but I've decided in the rules as written, when you get to 0 hit points, you're dead. There's no unconsciousness. I know in third edition you could try and stop if someone was unconscious, you could try and sort of stop the bleeding, and that would stabilise them until after the fight. There's none of that. You get to 0 hit points and you are dead. I decided I was going to adopt a commonish house rule, which is that if you get to 0 hit points, you have to roll on a death and dismemberment table. And the death and dismemberment table might say, well, yeah, you are dead, or it might say, well, you're unconscious till the end of the fight and then you come to with 1 hit point, or it might say you're unconscious and people have to carry you back home and you recover in 6 hours with 1 hit point, or it might say you have a scar and that lowers your charisma, or you've lost the use of one of your arms and one of your legs, and that has particular effects. That seems sort of more interesting. Another example of randomness, hopefully creating interesting results. But the death and dismemberment tables that I've seen use helmets a lot. There's a fair few results that say, well, if you've got a helmet, you hit on the head, and if you've got a helmet, you're okay, but if you don't have a helmet, then you're dead. Something like that. Partly that's a reaction to, in the original version of Dungeons and Dragons, helmets were one of the pieces of equipment you could buy, but they didn't have any effect. And obviously people thought that was a bit silly, and so they came up with a rule to make helmets more useful. Helmets aren't a piece of equipment in basic D&D, because by that point chainmail meant an entire suit of armor which included a chain shirt. So presumably it's a chain shirt and a helmet and greaves or whatever I don't really know what they historically wore. But I decided that it isn't, and Ulfric was the only one who had spare money to buy a helmet, so he's bought a helmet. He is the only person I had to change one of the attributes. He rolled quite low for strength, he rolled quite low for everything, and so his strength went up to 13. I should say that the supplement that I got has quite restrictive minimum attributes for bards and for rangers, and this is probably taken from Advanced Dungeons and Dragons or First Edition, in which they're sort of meant to be rare. And the way that they did that was they said, all right, well, you can do this, but you have to have 15 in this and 13 in this and 12 in this and 9 in this sort of thing. The result of that, from what I saw, was that people came up with systems for fudging the rolls so that they got those high numbers. It didn't result in bards and rangers being rare treats. It resulted in someone going, I want to be a ranger, so therefore I get to roll 5 times and choose the highest number or something. So I thought it was easier and better to just disregard those attribute requirements and let him be a ranger, because the version that I'm using seems to be cut down and a lot less powerful. In fact, I would say a ranger might actually be less powerful than a normal fighter because they can't use plate mail armour, which is the best sort of armour. Again, Ulfric didn't have enough money. The best armour he can use is chainmail, but he could only afford scale mail, which is better than leather armour and not as good as chainmail. And finally, in older games, it's quite easy and it was much more common. I don't know if it was normal, but it was much more common to have non-player character hirelings that you sort of took with you in return for usually a lesser share of the treasure. And so we managed to get Otho and Toby, two normal men, which is the basic D&D word for humans that don't have a character class. Basically, I suppose in 3rd edition they'd be commoners. I think they're still called commoners in 5th edition as well. I don't know what happened in 4th edition. They have no armor. They have no sort of class skills. They have clubs or daggers. I chose clubs, just seemed to fit a bit better, and they are carrying the torches. Another example of the odd vagueness of old school rules, it tells you how much torches cost. It doesn't tell you how to light a torch. Are there tinderboxes? Are there matches in this setting? I mean, I assume you can light a torch off another torch, but what are we doing? Do we have to get some kindling and rub 2 sticks together, or is there something else? There's certainly no tinderbox in the equipment list, and there's no guidance on. It tells you torches will light for an hour, so very specific, but it doesn't tell you how do you actually light one in the first place. It's as if it has a sort of on switch, which of course presumably isn't what was intended, but they probably just didn't think about it. I've decided that torches need a tinderbox and that Ulfric would have a tinderbox, just because as a ranger that would be something that he would need in order to start campfires and stuff. So that's all I have to say. I hope that wasn't too. I'm sort of not sure how much rules detail to go into. Please feel free to give feedback. But those are our characters, and next time we'll start the adventure. Hopefully, I will see you then.